welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the books that I read in the month of November. I actually don't have a ton of books to talk about. I finished 7 books in the month of November, which is on the low side for me, but some of the ones that I finished are very long, and I am also still currently working my way through Kristin Lavransdatter. I'm reading that with my friend Dia, and I'm still really enjoying it, but because I haven't finished it, I don't want to talk about it too much because I get the feeling that the context of the whole story and how it ends is going to matter quite a bit to me. So it's split up into 3 books, and I've read the first 2 books and I still have the 3rd book left. So I'll be updating you on that, probably, I'm guessing, for my December wrap up, letting you know how I ultimately felt about it. But right now I am still enjoying it so much, and the writing is so beautiful. I also was reading Cranford for my Patreon book club, and I've not yet finished it. So I'm actually going to probably include that in my December wrap up. So I have kind of a wide range of genres here, and that I have classics, I have nonfiction, I have middle grade fantasy, I have YA fantasy, and I have adult fantasy. So I guess it's a lot of fantasy. I'm gonna kick off with the nonfiction because it was nonfiction November, and I had plans to read a lot of nonfiction and it just didn't quite happen the way I had planned, but I did still get to 2 books. The first one was Adorning the Dark by Andrew Peterson. Isn't this just like the loveliest cover? It's so pretty. So this is a Christian nonfiction, and the subtitle on it says Thoughts on Community Calling and the Mystery of the Making. And so this is a book about how we are creators because God is a creator God, and it has a lot of like writing advice in here, songwriting and book writing, because Andrew Peterson has done both. So there were large sections of this book that didn't feel particularly applicable to me. I would think that this book would be invaluable to someone who is a writer of some sort, because he references that a lot. And I think also if you consider yourself an artist of some kind. I do not consider myself an artist of any kind, and so some of those were not as applicable to me, unfortunately, but I think the book overall was really beautiful, really well done. There were some really good chapters in here that I like starred in the table of contents because I want to be able to come back to them. There's a whole chapter about like finding a place to belong and what home means, and he writes about like moving to the country and kind of like connecting to the land and making it his own, and he references Wendell Berry in it, and that was just an amazing chapter. There's also one called The Integrated Imagination, which is all about how he connected with stories when he was young and what it was about fantasy stories that really spoke to him. And I thought that that was beautifully done, especially in context of, you know, more spiritual fantasies like the Chronicles of Narnia or Lord of the Rings. And then the last chapter is called Home is Real, and that was all about looking forward to and longing for heaven. And so overall, this book was really good. I did feel like some of it didn't apply to me and some of it wasn't as meaningful for me as it could have been if I considered myself an artist, but I still thought it was really beautiful. The other nonfiction that I read in the month of November was for my in-person book club, and that's The Shepherd's Life by James Rebanks. This was a book that I was highly anticipating and was like wondering if it could become a favorite book of the year. So much of this is so beautifully written, and he's detailing his experience as a shepherd who grew up being the son of a shepherd, the grandson of a shepherd, the great-grandson of a shepherd in the Lakes District in England, which is often romanticized for how beautiful it is without really acknowledging or telling the stories of the people who live there and work the land. So in many ways it's become a tourist destination without the depth and the meaning of what it means to survive there. So this is him telling his family's story, telling his own story. He was relatively uneducated, but ended up as an adult getting into Oxford and then becoming quite educated. And so he has a really cool story surrounding that as well. The writing was absolutely beautiful, but I did get pulled out of this book time and time again because the way that he tells the story is not very cohesive at times, because he tells it according to seasons. So we start with summer, then fall, then winter, and we end in spring. And within each season, he talks about what it's like to live on the farm, what was happening in his life at various ages, and he swings back and forth between past and present tense, which is something that kind of drives me nuts anyways. But if he had been writing in present tense for how the farm operates now that he's in charge, now that it's his farm, that would have made sense to me. but it was kind of seemed like there was no rhyme or reason as to why he was in present or past tense. Sometimes in the middle of a story, he would switch back and forth several times, which is incredibly jarring for me. And then he also would have like sometimes where he'd use past tense when he's talking about, you know, what the farm's like right now, but then present tense when he talks about a memory of when he was 4. And then there are stories in there where you're like, okay, but that doesn't have anything to do with anything. So I think that if this could have been more tightly edited, I would have enjoyed it more. And I do feel like it became more cohesive as the book went on, because by the time we get to the final season, which is spring, he's already given his background with education. He's already given his story about Oxford, about how he met his wife and fell in love and all of those kinds of things. So most of the section of spring is about lambing and about how they breed sheep and what they're looking for in that, and how they care for mothers as they're lambing, and how difficult that spring season is where there's still some of winter clinging on, and the challenges of lambing in weather conditions and all of those kinds of things. And all of that was really cohesive because he'd go back and forth between past and present a lot, but a lot of it was centered around the same topic, so it didn't seem quite as choppy. All that to say, I actually really loved this book, but if it had been more tightly edited, I think it would have been a 5-star book for me, but unfortunately it just wasn't. I think that it could have been perfect, but it just wasn't, unfortunately. So I read 2 classics in the month of November, one of which is a classic historical fiction, and that is Bread Givers, which I actually already talked about in depth in a vlog that I posted earlier this month. In that vlog, I read some books that were recommended to me by some of you that were like fall recommendations, and Charlene had recommended Bread Givers, which is a historical fiction, well, a classic historical fiction, because I think it was published in like the 1920s or the 1930s, about a Jewish family in New York City and kind of the challenges that they face as the father is very intellectual and sees his duty to his family to be studying the Torah, and as such he's not providing for his family at all. And so he's depending on the income that his daughters and his wife bring in while he's not working. So there's a lot of family tensions. It's told in the voice of the youngest child, who is the 4th daughter, and kind of like how their father tries to set them up with like wealthy men that will support them but also support him, so it's not the same like loss of income it would be otherwise. And it's really interesting. It calls back to several different books for me. Like, it reminds me of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn and the coming of age and like difficult family situations, plus the New York setting. And it also reminds me of All of a Kind Family, which is a middle grade about a Jewish family in New York City around the same time, I think. But that one's much happier, All of a Kind Family is, because it talks a lot about Jewish customs and what it was like to live in New York City at the time. But I felt like reminiscent of both of those books while I was reading it, and I enjoyed it. I also read my most anticipated book of the year, and I just posted a vlog about that with my very in-depth thoughts. So if you want more thoughts than what I'm giving you here, check out that vlog. That book is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. You've probably heard me say about 1,000,000 times by now, if you didn't see my favorites of last year, you've heard me mention in my favorites of last year that Agnes Grey was my favorite fictional book of 2023. And so I had really high hopes for The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which had been on my radar for far longer than Agnes Grey had. I have wanted to read this book for a really long time. I've owned this beautiful penguin cloth bound book for a really long time that a subscriber sent me, and so I was really happy to finally read it. I chose to read it in November because I often feel slumpy in November after kind of just like reading all the things for Victober. So I purposely chose a Victorian book that I was really, really excited about to read in November. And overall, this book did not disappoint. It actually is like so drama filled in a way I wasn't expecting, because Agnes Grey is a very quiet book. So I can see why people who started with The Tenant of Wildfell Hall might actually be disappointed in Agnes Grey, because it is more quiet and it is more feel good. And The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is not a feel good book. It's essentially about this woman, Mrs. Graham, Helen, who moves to this house in this town, and there's a lot of rumors circulating about her because she's wearing widow's clothing, she has a small child, and so people are speculating about her, and rumors are swirling about her, as they do in a small town. It's nice to know that that never changes. Apparently it's been like that for forever. But anyways, it's told in the perspective of a young man who lives in this town who falls in love with her, and then he subsequently finds out her backstory and all of that kind of stuff. And so it alternates between him writing letters to a friend about all the things that transpire, and then we have a huge chunk of Helen's diary in there as well. So I really liked it. It really is infuriating. The way that some of the things are portrayed here were probably quite controversial for their time, and that it really depicts kind of like the rights of women within a marriage, mainly that they didn't have any. They didn't have the freedom to leave or divorce or do any of those things in the same way that men did. And so a lot of that is highlighted in this book, and it made me really angry for a lot of the book. I found some of the elements of the ending to be kind of unsatisfying for me, and I go into more detail on that in my vlog. So if you want to go check that out and listen to my final thoughts there, you can hear why parts of it were unsatisfying for me. But the ending conclusion is that I still like Agnes Grey more than I like the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but I like them for entirely different reasons. Okay, let's move on to fantasy. Starting with a middle grade fantasy, I listened to the audiobook of The Ogress and the Orphans by Kelly Barnhill. And I knew that Kelly Barnhill was pretty popular because of The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which I think either won the Newbery or was a Newbery honor, but I haven't read that one either. But The Ogress and the Orphans was at my library, and so I picked it up, and I immediately fell in love with the writing in this story, as it is written in a very lyrical fairy tale voice about an ogress who has experienced some rejection and finally comes to live on the outskirts of this town that used to be a beautiful town, a town full of so much community. And one day their library burns down, and ever since then the townspeople just don't trust each other, and things just aren't the same anymore. And so the ogress decides she's going to reach out to this community secretly with acts of kindness, and there's an orphanage in this town as well. And it just, like, there's so much that's so lovely about it. There's some beautiful found family elements, the messaging about loving people who are different than you and not judging people based on their appearances or your ideas of them before you know them. They're good messages. But unfortunately, as the book progressed, I felt like it was about 100 pages too long. Like, I felt like we would just revisit the same things over and over and over again, where we would see one scene from one person's perspective, and then we'd switch to another perspective, and then sometimes even a third perspective, without actually gaining any more information. They're all seeing the same thing, and we're not getting anything new. And so it felt really repetitive in a lot of places. And while like I said, I like the messaging of the book, I felt like it hammered you over the head with it. And that felt like a bit much to me as an adult. But I think that even if I had been reading this aloud to my child when she was younger, I still would have felt the same way, because kids aren't stupid. They can pick up on messaging and understand what's happening with more subtlety than this author used. And I don't think that children's books have to be as subtle as adult books or anything like that. It was just like, it was more than heavy-handed. Like, it was like a mallet smacking you in the head for most of the book, which, because of that, made the story itself incredibly predictable. Like, nothing about it was surprising, even though there was supposed to be like this reveal at the end, and it wasn't surprising. I knew what was happening almost from the first chapter. And part of that could just be because I'm an adult, so I can let that part of it go. But ultimately, the repetitiveness and the heavy-handedness made me wish that this book was over far sooner than it was. So for the YA fantasy that I read The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. I actually did a Patreon vlog for this. So every month my patrons will suggest a book to me, and I will choose a book and do a spoilery vlog for them with all of my thoughts. So it was really exciting to do this one because it has been recommended to me by Christy Lewis for a really long time and I didn't get to it last year, and this year I've just been waiting all year until the perfect time to read it, and Christy recommended that I read it in November, which makes sense because it takes place on this island where there are these really vicious water horses that come out of the water, and they'll try to eat people, but the people have tried to tame them and then have races with them because they're faster than regular horses. And so every October they train all October long for these races, and then on November 1st is when the races take place. And so reading it in either October or November is like perfect timing, weather-wise, time of the year. And it was just like a really atmospheric read. I thought the writing was unbelievable. Like, I I was blown away by the prose in this book and how Maggie Stiefvater could say so much in one sentence, could evoke so much emotion. And it was like the ultimate showing versus telling of like what was happening and what people were feeling. And it was so incredibly immersive. This book was actually my favorite book of the month. It was the book I think that came the closest to 5 stars, but I was a little disappointed because I had a lot of questions about how things worked on this island and in this fantasy world, and why the races happened and what was going on with the horses, and none of those questions were answered. And I wanted more of the horses because the horses were one of the coolest things about the book, one of the most unique things. And I wish that we had just had more than we got of that, but the reading experience was still so good and so incredible, and I really loved the characters. I was rooting for the characters, and so I still really enjoyed it. The last fantasy book that I'm going to talk about is an adult fantasy, and it is actually also the last book that I finished this month, and it's The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. So I have now read all of the Mistborn books, yay, including the novellas, and this concludes Mist Along, which is a read along I've been doing for most of this year, reading through all of the Mistborn books. So if you're interested in any of the live chats for that, they're all in the live section on my channel, and it has just been such a blast to discuss these books. This book was so fun. I can't say a lot about it because it's the last book of Era 2 of Mistborn, so I can't really say very much about it without spoiling it. But what made this book even more fun is that I am also completely up to date on all of the Stormlight Archive books, and man, is there a lot of crossover between Stormlight and Mistborn in this book. And so that was really fun to see all the little connections everywhere, as well as just like some really amazing character development of some of the characters. Like one of my favorite characters that I've seen develop throughout this series is Steris. I love Steris. I think she's my favorite character in this era. I think Tensoon was my favorite character probably in Era 1, and Steris is probably my favorite in Era 2, although Wax's character development has been excellent, and Wayne's has, and Marasi has. I feel like Wayne's character development definitely took like a front seat in this book, but there was just like so many beautiful moments that happened here, as well as, you know, lots of humor because, well, if you've read these and you know how Wayne is, so there's plenty of humor, plenty of action, lots of things happening, lots of twists and turns, and it was just a fun ride. Well, those are all the books that I read in the month of November. If you've read these books, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, and I would love to hear what you've been reading. Please tell me what your favorite book was that you read in the month of November. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.